Hello and welcome to week 12 of Intro to American Studies. Before we jump into the reading, I have a quick comment about your reflections from 2 weeks ago. So in reflecting on the Stuart Winter reading about Black queer organizing against police brutality, many of you referred to queer people as queers. And in general, this is not considered a very respectful way of referring to people. It's kind of similar to calling Black people the blacks instead of Black people. The difference in general is using an adjective to describe people as queer or Black or whatever, as opposed to using the noun form that then defines the person entirely as that one thing. So thinking again about the concept of intersectionality that we've been studying, you could describe someone using a series of adjectives as a Black queer person, but you can't call them both a Black and a queer, because using the noun form forces you to only define the person based on one aspect of their identity. So just something to think about, and if you have any questions about this, please reach out to me. Now on to the reading. This week we are reading a chapter from Ngai's book, Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens, and the Making of Modern America. And this book has totally transformed my understanding of America and Americans, because Ngai shows how laws about US citizenship have been written and changed over and over again in order to produce and preserve the idea of America as a white nation. And in the book overall, she writes about Filipino and Mexican and Japanese and Chinese migration. And the whole book is excellent. But I decided to give you guys chapter 3, which is on Filipino migration, for two reasons. One is to include stories about a group of people that we have not studied yet. And the second is because the Filipino-American story reveals the nature of American empire and imperialism. So if you have not thought about the United States as an empire before reading this, you probably will after. And some important background to this chapter is what Ngai calls Asiatic exclusion. And she's using the language that the US government and other folks used, which is, yes, racist language. And what Asiatic exclusion was basically in the 19th century, many Chinese folks migrated to the US because there was a need for cheap labor. And as the Chinese population grew, anti-Chinese racism grew. And it grew to such a point that in 1882, the United States passed its very first immigration restriction law, which was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this act banned almost all Chinese people from immigrating to the United States, and it banned Chinese folks who are already here from becoming naturalized citizens. And I want to emphasize that it was the first immigration restriction law, because before that, believe it or not, there was barely any restriction on immigrating to this country. There were always racialized restrictions on citizenship, and Ngai talks a lot about those and all the complexities about those in her book, but there were not always limits on who could physically enter the country. And that's why Ngai calls her book, in the subtitle, The Making of Modern America, because this idea of restricting immigration is a modern idea produced in the 20th century to control what this country looks like and who can flourish here. At least that's the argument that Ngai is making. So in chapter 3, she's talking about Filipino migration experiences, but it's important to understand that Filipinos were showing up in the United States that had already completely banned Chinese people from entering because of anti-Chinese racism. And so even though most Filipino people do not have Chinese ancestry, right, those are not the same people, most white Americans didn't know or care about this difference and ended up lumping Filipinos into their already racist idea of Chinese people under this kind of broad category of Asian people, right, which is a product of racism coming from outside of these various places. Okay, so Ngai basically does 4 things in this chapter. And I will admit that the language she uses is dense at times, so if you're struggling with it, no worries. Hopefully my explanation will help, and as always, if you have questions, let me know. What is the first thing she does? So first, she shows how the U.S. colonized the Philippines. So last week we talked about how the U.S. fought Mexico in the Mexican-American War and conquered about half of what was Mexican territory, which is now the southwestern United States. And just a few years after the Mexican-American War, really, the U.S. goes to war against Spain and ends up conquering a bunch of formerly Spanish territory, most notably Puerto Rico, which is still a U.S. colony, as we discussed in Unit 1, and the Philippines. So these had been part of the Spanish Empire, and then when the United States wins its war against Spain, they become part of the American Empire. And this is sort of the beginnings of this idea of America having an empire. And so Ngai shows how this was a kind of a problem for the United States government because, right, the U.S. likes to see itself as, the land of the free, right? And so how does the land of the free conquer other people and accumulate an empire? It seems like it doesn't go together. And so in the case of Mexico, there weren't a ton of people living in that area yet. There were people, as Anzaldúa shows us, but it was pretty sparsely populated. And so after the U.S. conquered this formerly Mexican territory, the U.S. government basically gave white immigrants free land to increase the population of white people. And then, once there were enough white people there, they were invited to become states, and it was all good. They were incorporated into the United States. And this is how we end up with 50 states over time. But in the case of Puerto Rico and the Philippines, there were a ton of people living there already, and the U.S. government was not willing to add states full of people that it saw as not white to the country. And so essentially the the Supreme Court, right, invents this idea of an unincorporated territory and a U.S. national, so that the U.S. government could benefit economically from having access to more markets and resources, and they could benefit militarily from having more overseas bases, but at the same time, they could not have to give the people of Puerto Rico and the Philippines equal rights, right? And this is part of the reason that Puerto Rico is still not a state, right? Because Puerto Rico becoming a state means that it would get equal representation in Congress, and it would just change, right, the political dynamic in the country in a lot of ways. And so you can imagine if the Philippines was a state as well, that would dramatically change U.S. politics. So, in order to prevent, right, the Puerto Rico and the Philippines from becoming a state in the way that these other territories became states, right, they create these legal categories, unincorporated territory and U.S. national, so that the people of Puerto Rico and the Philippines can remain in this sort of colonized state. And Americans really convinced themselves that this was okay. So one thing I like about this chapter is Ngai uses a lot of great quotes. And so here's what President at the time, William McKinley, says. He says, quote, "We come not as invaders or conquerors, but as friends to protect the natives in their homes, in their employments, and in their personal and religious rights. The mission of the United States is one of benevolent assimilation." End quote. So the president is saying to the Filipino people, don't worry, we're not conquering you, we're doing this to help you so that you can become civilized like us. And so you can see the racism embedded in that statement. And of course, most Filipinos did not want the U.S. to come in and take over. And so the United States ends up in yet another war, the Philippine-American War, in which the U.S. military ends up murdering tens of thousands of Filipino people in order to not conquer them. So the first thing that Ngai teaches us in this chapter is that the US colonizes the Philippines while pretending it's not colonizing the Philippines. All right, number 2. Ngai shows how an unintended consequence of this colonization is that Filipinos, as US nationals, right, this new made-up legal category, can freely migrate to the US. So they don't have the full same rights as US citizens, but as US nationals, they can come into the United States freely. And so they are recruited by various businesses as low-wage labor, just as Chinese folks were before them. And so, just as happened with the Chinese before, the more Filipino people that migrate, the more anti-Filipino violence they face. And I think one of the most masterful things about this chapter is how Ngai shows how the reasons that white people gave for their dislike of Filipino people, right, that they were stealing their jobs or they were bringing wages down, were just not true. Right? So she shows how, in fact, white workers did not want the same low-wage agricultural and menial labor jobs that Filipino people were taking. And with regard to wages, Ngai shows how Filipino workers actually organized and went on strikes to prevent their bosses from undercutting white people's wages, right, from paying them less than white people. But white workers refused to join forces with Filipino workers in this fight. And so ultimately, Ngai shows how these reasons around jobs and wages do not hold up to evidence, and therefore the only real reason that white workers were attacking Filipino workers was racism. And she does acknowledge that many white workers may have really believed these lies about job and wage competition, but they were lies, and we hear these same lies used to attack immigrants today. Okay. Number 3, Ngai shows how, in addition to this fear of economic competition, Ngai shows how another reason that white folks gave for attacking Filipino migrants was that they didn't like them fraternizing with white women. And this, of course, is just pure racism, because there's no legitimate reason why, you can understand why someone might be upset about there being competition for their job, whether that's true or not, but there's no reason why any kind of man or woman or otherwise should or should not be allowed to be with anyone else based on race or anything else. So this is pure racism. And in order to address, right, this idea that Filipino men should not be able to be with white women, they had to change the laws around interracial marriage. And these laws are called anti-miscegenation laws. And so they had to change the laws to prevent Filipino men from marrying white women. And so again, Ngai's bigger point is that laws are used to change how people are racially categorized and to criminalize their behavior. So one of the wildest things that she shows us is that before these intermarriage laws were changed, there were Filipino men that married white women. And then they changed the laws and retroactively made these prior Filipino white marriages illegal. So if you were one of those people who had gotten married before the law changed, now suddenly your marriage is illegal. And so again, you can see how, right, it's not people's behaviors that are breaking the law, it's the law is then changing after the fact. And why did white folks care so much about intermarriage? Well, because they knew that if people could freely marry and have kids, then this made-up idea of a pure white race would disappear over time with all of these quote-unquote mixed-race babies. And then one group of people wouldn't be able to dominate the others using racist laws and policies. Excuse me. And as an aside, Ngai doesn't go into this, kind of future history of these laws, but it was completely legal to ban interracial marriage until 1967, which is when civil rights activists finally pushed the Supreme Court to rule these laws unconstitutional. So that's about 50 years ago that it was still illegal in some states to marry outside of your race. Okay, so number 2 is she shows us how sexuality was used to further oppress and control Filipino men. Number 4, by the 1930s, all this anti-Filipino racism has gotten to the point that a good number of white people are like, we just got to get these guys out of here. And they realize that the only way to legally do that is to end the U.S. colonization of the Philippines. And so ironically, they start advocating for Filipino independence. And sometimes they use the same flimsy economic arguments about jobs and wages as before, but often they were just explicitly racist ones. So again, here's a amazing yet terrifying quote from the California Joint Immigration Committee. They said, quote, "This government as founded was then a government of and for the white race. And it was, I think, with the thought and hope of its founders that it would continue to be the government of the whites." And this is the reason they're giving for why Filipinos should no longer, right, be allowed to be U.S. nationals. And nowadays, people don't generally use such explicitly racist language to oppose immigration, but they did in the 1930s, not even 100 years ago. And so finally, the U.S. government passes the Philippines Independence Act in 1934, which suddenly changes the status of Filipino people from U.S. nationals to foreign nationals. And so then the government could deport people. And so again, the people didn't change. They didn't break any immigration or citizenship laws. The laws changed to now criminalize them as non-citizens. And the U.S. government wanted to get rid of Filipino people so badly that they even offered to pay for them to return to the islands. But most did not take them up on this offer because they knew then they would never be able to come back. And when Ngai talks at the end of the chapter about repatriation, that's what she's talking about. That's just a fancy word for returning someone to their country. And Ngai makes it clear that while this Independence Act did eventually lead to Filipino political independence, the United States maintained the right to freely trade its goods in the Philippines and to establish military bases in the Philippines. And so this is what Ngai calls neo-colonialism, or new colonialism, which is based not on direct political control of another country, but on maintaining economic and military control. And the video I had you watch at the beginning of this unit about how America became a superpower shows how this neo-colonial strategy has been used around the world to increase U.S. wealth and power. So to this day, the United States has military bases all over the world. So hopefully you can see how intersectional Ngai's analysis is. She's talking about race and sexuality and citizenship and other categories of experience that I didn't even go into in this talk. And hopefully you can also see how transnational her analysis is, because she's showing how the very borders of the United States were changed to incorporate various overseas possessions and then to give them up, at least partially, when it was no longer socially or politically convenient. And, this book is really considered a model for transnational scholarship, and it's inspired a lot of work following it. So, as usual, your reflections and discussion board posts are due Sunday at midnight. Don't forget to answer all 3 reflection questions, and I will see you next week for our second to last reading.